China promises African nations $50 billion in loans and funding at a summit of leaders in Beijing. It underlines the country's position as the continent's #1 investor. What does this investment mean for Africa, China and its Western rivals? Abroad usually mean expenditure for most of us, but African leaders will be coming home from a summit in Beijing with pledges of more than $50 billion in loans and funding from their Chinese hosts.
Chinese exports have shattered records. The latest data is out. It shows China has a trade surplus of over $1 trillion. This has never happened before. And the year is not even over yet. So by the end of 2025, China could end up with an even bigger number because they're selling more than ever. And they're selling more despite the trade barriers. Trump has slapped tariffs on them. Exports to the US are down by 29%. Europe and Japan have imposed restrictions. And yet, Chinese exports are breaking records.
But coming back to Africa's prospects, when I do the arithmetic on my spreadsheets, I find that Africa can grow 7% to 10% per year for the next 40 years. In 1980, with its 1.4 billion people, China took off. India, with its 1.4 billion people, now 1.5, it started about 20 years after China in rapid growth, around 2000. I want Africa to start now. It's also got 1.5 billion people. It's the same size, actually.
Right. But the additional challenge of being multiple countries as opposed to singular nations.
Well, you know, in 1885, in that very polite Congress of Berlin, the European countries, with no Africans present, took the map and divided among themselves and colonized the whole damn continent and left it, in the end, as 55 separate countries on one continent where there's one China and there's one India.
Right.
That makes governance hard. And so my point about governance in Africa is be a union, really. Have an Africa continental free trade area. When you plan your infrastructure, don't plan it 55 times. Get that rail to connect across Africa. Get the highways to connect. Get the fiber to connect. Think of it as one country, basically. Think of it truly as a union.
The sense of disbelief spreading across the United States did not originate from a single announcement or dramatic policy shift. It emerged gradually through financial disclosures, investment reallocations, and capital flow data that revealed a historic redirection of wealth as China began pulling an estimated $500 billion out of American markets and redirecting it toward Africa. The magnitude of the move challenged long-held assumptions about where global economic power resides and where it is heading. For decades, the United States functioned as the primary destination for surplus global capital. Foreign governments, corporations, and institutions recycled earnings into U.S. Treasury bonds, equities, real estate, and corporate debt. This arrangement stabilized the dollar, financed government deficits, and reinforced American influence. Across global finance, China played a central role in this system, holding vast reserves in U.S. assets and contributing to market liquidity. The decision to unwind such a large portion of those holdings was not impulsive. It reflected a strategic reassessment of risk, opportunity, and long-term growth. The first signs appeared quietly. Treasury demand softened. Certain asset classes experienced declining foreign participation. Long-term capital commitments gave way to shorter investment horizons. While none of these changes caused immediate disruption, together they pointed to a deeper structural shift. Capital that once flowed almost automatically into the U.S. was now searching for alternatives. China's redirection of investment toward Africa was not merely a reaction to trade tensions or political disagreements. It was rooted in a broader evaluation of global economic trends. American markets, while deep and liquid, were increasingly perceived as saturated, politically volatile, and exposed to regulatory unpredictability. Sanctions, export controls, and financial restrictions transformed what had once been a neutral investment environment into a strategic risk. In contrast, Africa presented a different equation. Across the African continent, China identified long-term growth drivers that aligned with its strategic priorities. Rapid population expansion, accelerating urbanization, rising consumer demand, and chronic infrastructure gaps created opportunities for capital to generate both financial returns and geopolitical influence, investments. were directed not toward speculative instruments, but toward physical assets that anchor economic activity for decades. Rail networks connected resource-rich interior regions to ports. Power generation projects stabilized electricity supply for industrial use. Ports and logistics hubs reduced transportation costs and improved trade efficiency. Industrial parks enabled local manufacturing and processing, shifting value creation closer to production sites. These projects were designed to reshape economic fundamentals rather than chase short-term profits. The scale of the investment mattered. $500 billion is not venture capital. It is system-shaping capital. Its movement alters trade routes, supply chains, labor markets, and political relationships. As this capital flowed into Africa, it accelerated trends that were already underway, transforming the continent from a peripheral participant in global trade into a central node. The reaction in the United States reflected more than concern over lost investment. It exposed a deeper realization that global capital no longer viewed American dominance as inevitable. Financial leadership depends on confidence, predictability, and growth prospects as political polarization, policy reversals, and economic uncertainty increased. That confidence weakened. Meanwhile, African governments demonstrated growing agency in how capital was deployed. Investment agreements increasingly included requirements for local employment, technology transfer, and domestic ownership. Infrastructure projects were aligned with national development strategies rather than external extraction models. This marked a departure from earlier eras when foreign investment often reinforced dependency rather than development. The contrast between capital behavior in the United States and Africa became increasingly stark. In the U.S., investment was defensive, focused on preserving value amid uncertainty. In Africa, investment was expansive, oriented toward building future capacity. This divergence reshaped global perceptions of opportunity. The implications extended beyond bilateral relations as trade between China and African economies expanded. Financial systems adapted. Transactions increasingly bypassed traditional dollar-based mechanisms. Regional payment platforms, bilateral settlement arrangements, and alternative financing structures reduced reliance on U.S.-controlled financial infrastructure. While the dollar remained dominant, its monopoly weakened incrementally. Europe felt the impact as well. African producers, supported by new infrastructure and financing, began competing more effectively in global markets. Supply chains that once favored European manufacturers shifted, access to resources became more contested. Europe's economic leverage over Africa diminished, complicating transatlantic coordination. Within the United States, debates intensified over how to respond. Some policymakers argued for renewed engagement with Africa through investment partnerships and infrastructure financing. Others favored doubling down on protectionism and economic pressure. The absence of a unified strategy reflected uncertainty about how to operate. In an increasingly multipolar economic system, the disbelief stemmed from the speed at which assumptions unraveled. For generations, the United States had been the default destination for global capital. The idea that hundreds of billions could be redirected elsewhere challenged foundational beliefs about economic centrality. Yet capital is pragmatic. It flows toward growth, stability, and long-term returns, not sentiment or tradition. Africa's emergence as a preferred investment destination did not occur in isolation. It coincided with broader shifts in global demographics and production. As aging populations constrained growth in developed economies, Africa's youthful workforce offered a demographic dividend. As climate and resource pressures intensified, Africa's role in energy transition, minerals, agriculture, and renewable potential grew more significant. China's investment strategy recognized these realities. By embedding itself in Africa's economic infrastructure, it positioned itself at the heart of future growth cycles. These investments generated influence not through force but through integration. Ports, power grids, and factories became conduits of long-term partnership. The American response highlighted a central challenge of modern economic leadership. Power built on financial centrality is vulnerable when alternatives mature. Efforts to enforce dominance through restriction and pressure often accelerate diversification. The more uncertain the environment becomes, the more capital seeks stability elsewhere. Africa's growing role in global trade altered narratives that had persisted. For decades, the continent was no longer viewed solely through the lens of aid or extraction. It was increasingly recognized as a market, a producer, and a strategic partner. This shift reshaped how global institutions, investors, and governments engaged with Africa. As the capital shift continued, its effects compounded. Infrastructure investments unlocked productivity gains across sectors, manufacturing capacity expanded regional trade, logistics improvements reduced costs and increased competitiveness. These changes reinforced each other, creating momentum that attracted additional investment. The disbelief in the United States was not about losing money alone. It was about losing narrative control over where the future was being built. For much of the modern era, progress was assumed to flow toward Western markets. Now, capital signaled a different story. This moment marked a transition rather than a collapse. The United States remained a major economic power with deep markets and innovative capacity. But the era of uncontested financial centrality was ending. Economic influence was dispersing across regions aligned with growth potential rather than historical dominance. Africa's rise, accelerated by China's investment, exemplified this transformation. It demonstrated how quickly global priorities could shift when opportunity, strategy, and capital converged. The redirection of $500 billion was not an endpoint but a signal of future trends. The conclusion is not that one power replaced another, but that the global economy entered a new phase. Multipolar growth, diversified capital flows, and regional development hubs are redefining influence. Those who adapt will shape. The next chapter, those who cling to old assumptions will struggle to understand why the world moved on. The disbelief felt in the United States reflects a moment of reckoning. The future is no longer anchored in one place. It is being built wherever capital, infrastructure, and vision align. And once capital commits to building the future, it rarely looks back. The impact of China redirecting $500 billion away from American assets to Africa continued to ripple through global financial systems, revealing vulnerabilities that had long been ignored. What started as a massive reallocation of capital became a catalyst for structural changes in trade, investment, and geopolitical influence. The United States, long accustomed to being the default destination for surplus global capital, faced a new reality. The assumptions underpinning its dominance were being systematically challenged. American markets, which had for decades relied on consistent foreign investment to maintain liquidity and stability, began to experience subtle yet significant shifts. Treasury yields adjusted upward as demand softened, while equities and corporate debt markets began to see reduced participation from foreign investors. These trends were not catastrophic in isolation, but collectively they undermined confidence in the U.S. financial ecosystem. Investors who had once viewed America as a safe harbor started to reconsider their strategies, increasingly looking toward emerging economies where growth and infrastructure promised better returns and stability. Africa's rising prominence as an investment destination was no accident. The continent's demographic trends, urbanization, rates, and resource potential presented an unmatched combination of long-term growth and untapped markets. China's investment strategy recognized this. Rather than chasing speculative short-term gains, Chinese capital was directed toward infrastructure projects, industrial parks, energy grids, and logistics networks. These projects were designed not only to yield financial returns but also to anchor economic growth within the region, creating self-reinforcing cycles that would secure influence for decades. The scale and scope of these investments allowed Africa to assert unprecedented agency. Governments were no longer passive recipients of foreign aid or investment. They were active negotiators, establishing terms that ensured technology transfer, local employment, and participation in value chains. This marked a departure from historical patterns, where external powers largely dictated economic engagement. Africa's leaders leveraged the influx of capital to accelerate industrialization, expand regional trade, and diversify markets. By doing so, they positioned the continent not as a periphery to Western economies, but as a central player in shaping global economic trends. For the United States, the implications were profound. Reduced foreign demand for U.S. debt, diminished capital inflows, and a relative decline in strategic leverage eroded traditional tools of economic influence. Policy mechanisms that had long relied on American financial centrality now faced limits. Washington's strategies to assert control over global trade, investment, and monetary systems were increasingly challenged by the emergence of new power centers in Africa and Asia. The world was entering a multipolar era where economic dominance could no longer be assumed. Africa's integration into global trade networks further amplified these dynamics. Investments in ports, transportation corridors, and industrial zones facilitated more efficient supply chains that bypassed traditional Western channels. These improvements not only boosted domestic productivity but also enabled African producers to compete directly with European and American firms in global markets. Resources that had once flowed predominantly to Western nations were now increasingly retained within the continent or redirected toward partners willing to invest in long-term development. This shift was mirrored in monetary arrangements. As trade between Africa and China expanded, financial systems adapted to reduce reliance on the dollar. Bilateral settlements, regional payment platforms, and alternative currency mechanisms gained traction. While the dollar remained a dominant global currency, its exclusive role as the central vehicle of international trade began to erode. This financial diversification weakened one of the United States' key levers of influence, demonstrating that economic power is inseparable from monetary control. European economies also experienced shocks. Long-standing trade relationships and access to African resources were disrupted as African nations exercised their newfound bargaining power. European producers faced increased competition from African industrialized sectors backed by Chinese finance, infrastructure, and technology markets. Previously dominated by European exports became more competitive, eroding historical advantages. The continent's political and economic influence in Africa, built over centuries, was being recalibrated rapidly in response to strategic shifts. The consequences extended beyond economics into geopolitical strategy. Africa's growing self-determination in its economic partnerships allowed the continent to diversify alliances and reduce dependency on any single external power. The United States, long accustomed to wielding economic influence through trade and aid, found its leverage diminished. Capital and commerce were moving toward regions demonstrating stability, growth, and strategic foresight, regardless of historical alignments. American policymakers confronted the reality that capital is ultimately pragmatic. It follows opportunity, not sentiment or tradition. China's approach exemplified this pragmatism. By anchoring capital in Africa's physical and institutional infrastructure, it secured long-term influence. Industrial parks, power grids, and port facilities became embedded into the continent's economic fabric, creating systems that were difficult to displace. The investments were mutually beneficial. Africa gained the infrastructure and resources needed for development, while China secured supply chains, resource access, and strategic partnerships. The United States, by contrast, faced the challenge of competing with these entrenched structures while attempting to maintain influence through more conventional mechanisms. This realignment had cascading effects on global growth narratives. Africa's rapid urbanization, young workforce, and rising consumer class positioned it as one of the few regions capable of sustaining long-term economic expansion. As Chinese investment facilitated industrialization and infrastructure development, Africa became a hub for innovation, trade, and production. Countries that had been marginalized in global decision-making now emerged as key actors in determining global economic trajectories. The shift was particularly visible in trade patterns. African manufacturers, supported by enhanced infrastructure and investment, began supplying both regional and global markets more effectively. Resource flows shifted, and supply chains reoriented to reflect Africa's new role as a strategic hub. Europe and the United States, which had long relied on historical dominance and established trade routes, faced the challenge of adapting to a global system increasingly defined by African agency and Chinese capital. Financial influence followed economic realignment as African economies integrated more deeply with China and other global partners. Alternative settlement mechanisms and trade financing systems reduced reliance on traditional dollar-denominated platforms. This diversification of financial instruments diminished one of the United States' central economic levers, its ability to enforce policy preferences through monetary control. Capital, trade, and influence were now moving in tandem toward the continents and regions, offering growth, stability, and strategic engagement internally. The United States confronted both economic and strategic dilemmas. Policy debates intensified over whether to pursue renewed engagement with Africa or rely on defensive economic measures. Trade restrictions, sanctions, and export controls were less effective in an environment where African nations exercised agency and attracted alternative investment. The U.S. faced the challenge of balancing domestic economic interests with the realities of a multipolar global system. Africa's rise, accelerated by China's capital infusion, signaled a permanent recalibration of global economic gravity. Infrastructure investments created long-term growth engines, industrialization expanded regional competitiveness, and financial diversification challenged historical hierarchies. The United States remained a major global player, but the era of uncontested economic and financial centrality was effectively over. Influence now required collaboration, investment, and adaptation, not simply reliance on historical advantage. In conclusion, the reallocation of $500 billion from the United States to Africa represented more than a financial decision. It was a turning point in the global economic order, highlighting the emergence of a multipolar system in which African nations exert significant agency. China exercises strategic foresight, and traditional Western dominance is recalibrated. The implications span trade, finance, industrial capacity, and geopolitical influence. Africa's trajectory demonstrates that capital, when aligned with long-term growth, infrastructure development, and strategic partnerships, can reshape global power dynamics. The United States faces the challenge of responding to this new reality, where leadership depends on engagement, adaptability, and participation in building future growth, rather than assuming dominance based on historical precedent. This reconfiguration of global investment and influence is likely to define the economic landscape for decades, marking a historic moment in the shift of global economic gravity.